Bonjour et bienvenue à l'auditorium Jacqueline Liechtenstein. Je suis Éric de Chassey, le directeur de l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art, et je suis très heureux de vous accueillir ici pour ce colloque sur les pionniers de l'art africain contemporain. Welcome to you all, especially the ones of you who are following online. I'm Éric de Chassey, director of the INHA, and I'm happy to welcome you here for this symposium on pioneers of contemporary African art. I'm going to speak in French. I apologize, but I don't know. I mean, I didn't know what language to use. I know that there are translations available, and I just thought that it was better to speak French, especially for the people who are following online. Pour commencer, je voudrais remercier les participants à ce colloque qui ont pris du temps sur leur emploi du temps pour être physiquement présents parmi nous. Je veux rappeler à quel point cela peut sembler habituel pour beaucoup d'entre nous qui venons d'Europe ou des États-Unis, mais que les orateurs ont fait de nombreux sacrifices pour venir ici, ceux qui viennent des États-Unis aussi, hein, mais eux plus, surtout dans cette période de Covid, ce qui veut dire période de tests et de restrictions de voyage encore plus fortes que d'habitude, si c'était possible. Faire une demande de visa depuis l'Afrique pour se rendre en Europe est un processus particulièrement compliqué et souvent éprouvant qui prend de nombreuses semaines et venir jusqu'à Paris signifie souvent faire des voyages extrêmement longs, y compris répétés, ne serait-ce que pour obtenir le visa, puisqu'il n'y a pas de procédure en ligne et qu'il faut à chaque fois se déplacer. Je voudrais remercier de façon particulièrement chaleureuse celles et ceux d'entre vous qui ont fait cet effort particulier et dire ma joie au nom de l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art qu'il puisse être présent aujourd'hui avec nous dans ces circonstances. L'Institut national d'histoire de l'art est d'autant plus heureux d'accueillir cet événement que celui-ci rentre en résonance avec des orientations profondes et des orientations très anciennes de l'INHA qui fête cette année ses 20 ans. L'une des missions qui nous est assignée est de promouvoir et de soutenir la coopération internationale dans le domaine de l'histoire de l'art et alors que ça n'allait pas du tout de soi à l'origine de l'institution, il est apparu, je ne sais pas si c'est apparu comme naturel, en tout cas c'est apparu comme nécessaire, de faire en sorte que l'INHA se préoccupe fortement des enjeux de la mondialisation et des défis que la mondialisation ou globalisation, on emploie l'un ou l'autre terme suivant le contexte dans lequel on parle et la langue dans laquelle on parle, le défi que cette mondialisation lance à l'histoire de l'art. Depuis donc pratiquement l'origine de l'INHA, l'Afrique a été présente non pas en tant qu'objet spécifique de programmes de recherche, mais en tant que terrain envisagé dans un contexte plus large, à partir de la création du domaine de recherche placé sous la responsabilité de Zahir Amani, qui s'appelait Histoire de l'art mondialisé, puis non, elle s'appelle aujourd'hui Histoire de l'art mondialisé, qui s'appelait d'abord Art et mondialisation et qui s'appelle aujourd'hui Histoire de l'art mondialisé. Cela dit, il faut bien reconnaître qu'il s'agissait surtout du nord du continent africain et assez peu de ces différents suds, même si ils étaient quand même déjà présents. L'idée de la conférence sur l'art africain contemporain a été lancée il y a déjà plus de 2 ans et elle devait initialement être organisée l'année dernière pendant la saison africaine initiée par l'Institut français. Pour des raisons qui sont des raisons évidentes, cela n'a pas pu avoir lieu. Mais à l'occasion de cette saison africaine, l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art, qui, vous le savez, possède les collections de la plus grande bibliothèque d'art et d'archéologie au monde, s'était penché sur ses propres collections et avait procédé à un examen critique afin de mieux cerner les lacunes au sein de sa bibliothèque, mais aussi de saisir ce qui a pu, au sein d'une bibliothèque d'histoire de l'art de référence, faire l'objet d'attention ou d'inattention depuis l'époque de sa constitution au début du XXe siècle. Donc, on a commencé quand même à travailler de façon importante. Il s'agit effectivement de repérer des lacunes, mais il s'agit aussi de les combler. En 2017, l'INHA a lancé son premier programme portant spécifiquement sur l'art en Afrique, sur l'histoire de l'art en Afrique. Le programme de recherche Vestiges, indices, paradigmes, lieu et temps des objets d'Afrique, qui est dirigé par Claire Bosc-Chassey et qui est consacré aux objets d'Afrique d'avant 1900 et des impensés épistémologiques qu'il faut déconstruire pour inclure ces corpus et les questions que ceux-ci soulèvent dans une réflexion plus juste et plus mûre. Mais encore une fois, on peut dire que le travail de l'INHA portait sur autre chose que sur l'art contemporain africain, quoi que ce soit qu'on entende par ce terme, puisqu'on verra, d'après ce que je vois du programme, dont j'ai suivi la constitution d'un peu loin, mais quand même en regardant un certain nombre de choses, la frontière entre art moderne et art contemporain n'est pas toujours extrêmement précise, et d'ailleurs on voit que certains des artistes envisagés figurent dans des expositions ou dans des collections permanentes de musées de façon un petit peu différente de ce point de vue-là. Je voudrais juste, pour terminer sur cette partie de l'INHA et l'Afrique, vous rappeler qu'en 2021, donc pendant la pandémie, l'INHA a publié un portail intitulé Sismographie des luttes et qui est aussi dirigé par Zahia Rahmani pour donner accès aux revues culturelles et critiques du monde, aux revues essentiellement anticoloniales et diasporiques, avec pour le coup un corpus extrêmement important provenant de l'ensemble du continent africain, et avec cette fois-ci une majorité provenant de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Un portail qui est en ligne, qui fait une nomenclature et propose la consultation, directement ou indirectement, de dizaines, voire plusieurs centaines de revues depuis le XVIIIe siècle, avec l'abeille haïtienne, jusqu'aux années 1970. Donc, en gros, je dirais que l'INHA était prêt à accueillir ce colloque. Il aura fallu du temps, il a fallu créer une espèce de contexte plus large, mais effectivement, on est de ce point de vue-là prêt, et nous souhaitions, à partir des constats que nous avions établis dans ces différentes entreprises, contribuer à l'intérêt du public et des chercheuses et des chercheurs et à la nécessaire introspection de l'histoire de l'art sur ce sujet en organisant cette conférence. Nous avons, je dois dire, profité et en même temps écouté Riason Naidoo, qui était chercheur invité à l'INHA en 2020-2021 pour l'organisation de ce colloque. C'est Riason qui a proposé, alors qu'il était présent à Paris, dans une période particulièrement difficile, c'était le début de la crise du Covid, et nous avons pu nous rendre compte immédiatement qu'être originaire d'un pays africain à Paris en période de vérification permanente des papiers d'identité et de suspicion extrêmement importante de non-conformité aux règles sanitaires rendait ce séjour assez difficile. Mais il a persisté et j'en suis extrêmement heureux. Il a travaillé ici et nous a proposé l'organisation explicite de ce colloque. C'était la bonne personne pour le faire. Ces 2 années à Paris ont, je crois, été particulièrement fructueuses. Il a publié de nombreux papiers. Il a réalisé une exposition 9-3, un projet d'art public avec des artistes africains contemporains qui est installé dans la ville de Saint-Denis. Je le remercie vraiment très très chaleureusement d'avoir conçu et pensé cette manifestation. Sans doute, l'absence de certains grands noms dans le programme ne manquera pas de surprendre, en tout cas de noms plus familiers du public parisien. Grâce à un certain nombre d'expositions, on peut penser aussi bien, pour prendre des exemples vraiment très très différents, à Ernest Mancoba ou à Chéri Samba. Au cours des discussions préparatoires à ces deux journées, nous avons reconnu l'importance des manifestations qui avaient permis de faire connaître leurs travaux. Je pense notamment à l'exposition consacrée à Ernest Mancoba au Centre Pompidou en 2019, qui est organisée par Alicia Knock et que je salue ici. Mais il nous a semblé que pour ces deux journées, il pouvait être intéressant de compléter ces grandes manifestations en mettant en avant d'autres artistes, collectifs et mouvements. Il aurait évidemment fallu plus d'une semaine de colloques pour rendre justice à toute la diversité de ces mouvements et tendances sur l'ensemble du continent, mais nous avons tenté d'esquisser une idée de cette diversité, à la fois à travers les sujets, mais aussi à travers les invités que nous avons conviés ici. Malheureusement, certains d'entre eux ou certaines d'entre elles n'ont pas pu venir, nous les regrettons, mais il faudra trouver d'autres occasions pour les réinviter. Je crois que ce colloque est un début, une invitation à aller plus loin, c'est une invitation à travailler et à en apprendre davantage sur l'art africain contemporain et ses nombreuses voies. Je crois que nous pouvons aussi, d'une certaine manière, le dédier à la mémoire de Dominique Malaquais, qui a été une pionnière importante pour l'histoire de l'art africain contemporain en France, qui avait dédié tout son travail aux scènes africaines artistiques, aux scènes artistiques africaines, en particulier celles du Cameroun, d'Afrique du Sud et du Congo. Elle aurait dû être avec nous à ce colloque et nous regrettons profondément sa disparition, aussi pour l'absence qu'elle impose aujourd'hui. Pour conclure sur les remerciements et laisser la parole au fond, je voudrais finir en mentionnant d'autres membres de l'INHA qui ont participé à la réalisation de cet événement. France Nerlich, directrice des études et de la recherche à l'INHA, a eu la vision de cette conférence et en a confié l'organisation et la conception à Riason Naidoo. Il était important pour l'INHA que la conférence soit conceptualisée et développée non pas de l'intérieur mais de l'extérieur, ou plutôt de l'intérieur de l'histoire qu'il s'agit d'étudier. Il était important pour nous que des intervenants d'Afrique et de la diaspora africaine fassent entendre leurs travaux et leurs témoignages sur l'art africain contemporain. Des historiens de l'art, des historiennes de l'art, des conservatrices, des conservateurs, des artistes qui réfléchissent sur l'art contemporain africain dans un processus qui est à la fois un processus autocritique et un processus de mise en perspective historique. Je tiens aussi à remercier le service des manifestations de l'INHA et en particulier Elsa Najm, qui était responsable de la logistique de la conférence et qui a fait un travail remarquable, allant jusqu'à organiser en temps réel les déplacements des intervenants. Elle a été là à la fois pour l'organisation et aussi pour le soutien dans des démarches, je l'ai dit en entrée, souvent compliquées, nous le savons bien, ceux qui sont ici. Elsa a vraiment été le moteur, le cœur qui a rendu cette conférence possible. Elle a été assistée par Marie Bruno, une stagiaire de l'INHA, qui a également suivi de près le processus tout au long de la conférence. Je pense que l'une comme pour l'autre, c'est un moment important. Enfin, je veux remercier l'équipe des moyens techniques qui rend la rencontre possible au cours des 2 jours. L'équipe de la communication également et remercier la Direction générale du patrimoine et de l'architecture du ministère de la Culture pour son soutien généreux à cette manifestation. Au moment où la France vit une période électorale difficile, délicate, dans laquelle la question de l'accueil inconditionnel, pour reprendre l'expression de Jacques Derrida, est plus que jamais à l'altérité, est plus que jamais remise en cause. Il me semble un signe encourageant, quelle que soit l'issue de ces élections, qu'un tel colloque puisse se dérouler ici à Paris. Je vous souhaite de beaux et de fructueux échanges à toutes et à tous au cours de 2 journées qui promettent d'être très intenses. Merci.
Voilà, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je m'associe évidemment à ces mots d'Éric de Chassey, directeur général de l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art. Et je voudrais dire que plus qu'une vision, ça a été plutôt des échanges très nourris avec Riason Naidoo, avec aussi toute une communauté pardon, je vais peut-être enlever ça pour que vous m'entendiez mieux pendant ma prise de parole, de chercheuses et de chercheurs avec qui nous avons pu discuter de ce que l'INHA, l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art, pouvait faire dans le cadre de la saison Africa 2020. Nous avons eu plusieurs réunions formelles, informelles, avec Sarah Fio-Salgas, ici présente aussi, avec Zahia Rahmani, évidemment, Claire Bosquetier, Maureen Murphy, Félicité Bollenstein, des discussions qui nous ont donné beaucoup d'idées, d'inspiration, et je pense que c'est aussi un processus qui a mûri et qui aujourd'hui nous amène à nous retrouver avec un délai, mais avec d'autant plus de joie. Et je voudrais sans plus tarder présenter notre première intervenante, Elisabeth Giorgis, qui sera à distance avec nous. Malheureusement, le déplacement n'a pas pu se faire dans les temps. Elisabeth Giorgis, qui est professeure d'histoire de théorie et de critique d'art à Charjah, au African Institut, et qui a été longtemps directrice de l'Institut of Ethiopian Studies, doyenne du College of Performing and Visual Art et directrice du Modern Art Museum, Gebre Christos Data Center à l'Université d'Addis Abeba. Bonjour Elisabeth, vous êtes à distance. Elisabeth est l'auteur de plusieurs publications, dont sans doute Modernist Art in Éthiopie de 2019 est l'une des plus connues, une des premières études monographiques entièrement consacrées au modernisme visuel en Éthiopie, dans une histoire sociale et intellectuelle plus large. Elle est également membre de plusieurs comités de rédaction de revues comme North East African Studies, Ethiopian Journal of Social Science and Humanities, et de rédactions comme celle du Journal for Critical African Studies, et j'en passe encore beaucoup d'autres. C'est une pionnière aussi, c'est une femme d'action. Elle est commissaire de plusieurs expositions au musée d'art moderne de Gebre Christos Data Center, récemment avec une exposition consacrée à l'artiste Olafur Eliasson, et elle a réalisé ces dernières années aussi de grandes rencontres, notamment cette initiative des humanités africaines intitulée Africa's Concept, décolonisation, émancipation et liberté, qui était parrainée par la Fondation Mellon et le consortium des sciences humaines, des centres et des instituts. Nous sommes aujourd'hui très honorés de sa présence, de l'ouverture du colloque par Elisabeth Giorgis, et nous la remercions infiniment de sa prise de parole tout de suite. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Should I begin? I guess, yeah. Thank you for the generous introduction. And thank you to the National Institute of Art History and to Riason Naidoo for inviting me to be part of this conference, Pioneers of African Contemporary Art. My talk will focus on the Ethiopian Modernists of the 1960s, which I wrote about in my book. So basically, I will generally read excerpts from my book, Modernist Art in Ethiopia. So understanding the present movements of decolonization requires an understanding of the social movements of the 1960s, of which the pioneers of contemporary art were part and parcel. So it also requires an understanding of the specific histories of these movements. They're multiple as well as transnational. So the complexities that arise when one attempts to understand specific colonial histories, in my case, the relationship of Ethiopia to the history of colonialism and decolonization due to the country's specific colonial history is critical to explore. Ethiopia had never been colonized except for a brief occupation by fascist Italy from 1936 to 1941. So although some say that this occupation amounts to colonialism, I would like to take the conventional Ethiopian line of occupation rather than a colonial endeavor, since this line conveys the complexities and complications that incited the range of Ethiopian modernism that I cover in my book. So that said, the second chapter of my book focuses on the modernism of the 1960s, a period I call the Prime of Modernism, which I argue that without doubt, the period was the most important historical period that fundamentally changed the course of modern Ethiopian history. So, and any study of the movements of decolonization in the 1960s naturally entails, among other things, the beginning of competing ideologies of the colonial past in wider thoughts of colonial consciousness and relations. However, what's particularly striking in the body of knowledge that was produced in Ethiopia in the 1960s is its broad distance from the histories and theories of colonialism. It is in this regard that I approach the artistic modernism of the 1960s, and particularly the works of the two important modernists, Skender Bogosian and Gabra Christos Desta, from a proper perspective in view of their intellectual origin and evolution and how they shaped the subsequent articulation of Ethiopian modernism. So let me begin with the Skender, and I also begin the book with an anecdote, sort of a tale of our friendship. Mine and Skender's, we were good friends. So I met Skender in 1996 and remained close to him, close to his death in 2003. I was a banker in New York City when I met Skender, and by 2002, I had abandoned my banking profession to join the Museum Studies program at New York University. And Skender's aesthetic imaginings and incredible artistic philosophy played a major part in this decision that forever altered my professional life. And today, I'm an art historian, a very distant profession than what I did for 17 years as a banker in New York. So I will quote an excerpt from the long anecdote that I open my book with, kind of an homage to a fascinating pioneer of Ethiopian modernism. I had met Skender in 1996, and by then I was familiar with seeing strange objects in his home, which he also used as a working studio space. Nothing was customary with Skender, even the friends who delivered shreds, odds and ends. The truth is, I had also become this type of friend. So the regulation and uniformity of my world, so closely related to my former career in banking and finance, had been disrupted by the furiousness of his place. I found that I had begun to relish the beauty of wreckage. And in the beginning of our friendship, I was confused by the objects and the disarray, which was truly extraordinary. The futon sleeper, tilted and damaged, was always covered with a board that was only removed when a guest required a seat. The chair was frequently concealed by painting accessories. The table was enveloped in canvases. And of course, the bed was comfortably occupied by Kali the cat. So newspapers, plastic bags, wood scraps, and other odd items had long since taken over the floor, and my early attempts to organize the space elicited his fury. So nor was he amused by indifference to his clutter. Rather, he demanded absolute and complete sensitivity to it. So his was a space without restraint, where furniture and equipment were equally functional, their ultimate endurance and performativity accidental rather than deliberate. They became part of the clutter, anticipating their fate to be destroyed, molded, and then reborn, or not, sometimes after years of waiting to no avail. But the finished paintings always dominated, impeccable and overwhelmingly attractive. The paintings conveyed sheer pleasure amid the bewildering commotion. So on a typical day at Skander's, atypical as every day always was, the clutter, the paintings, the cat, the music, and his loud voice somehow harmonized and resonated with the visitor. The music was almost always jazz. As his friend Solomon Deresa had said, jazz, the supreme creation of a people in exile, opened Skander to his own experiences of exile. And so I learned to accept this paradox of normality and even to appreciate the genius of the state of disorder and its perfect harmony in the midst of pandemonium. So what had felt like anxiety when I was first introduced to his language of objects, their secret innocence or duplicity, had in time become excitement. I had grown accustomed to the enigmatic nature of visual elicitations. Through my friendship with him, I came to realize that, as had happened in our shared country's history, texture and time cooperate in evoking specific forms and entities out of a world of muddles. And everything in that room of his had a purpose, perhaps not as yet obvious, but nonetheless a fate. His obsession with creating from wreckage had stimulated my mind. And I knew soon after I met him that I would write about shapes that had already emerged or were in the process of emerging. I would someday understand forms and expose new ones that were there all along in textures, compositions, and relationships. Many years after his death, the most vivid memories of his home come to mind, particularly his fascination with things that witness their time. And so in this book, I make an attempt to appreciate the forms and texture of an Ethiopian aesthetic by simultaneously unraveling the potency of its space. So that said, that is the expert, and I begin. Skander Bogosian, who is widely believed to be one of the founders of Ethiopian modernism, studied art in Paris from 1957 to 1966 at the height of the movement for African liberation and independence and its politicized philosophy. If the artist's craft was of particular importance, deconstructing the boundaries of European modernism that codified theories of images, shapes, and movements was equally critical for Skander, as works for art outside the West were considered either primitive or lacking in and mimetic of a discriminatory modern European universal. Inspired by decolonization's landscape of optimism, Skander re-examined and unpacked conventional narratives of European modernism to generate his own articulation of African modernism. As African art historian Salah Hassan has indicated, early modernists such as Skander revealed the plurality of modernity, even in its European context, and the realization that there are other modernism beyond the European context. So with its political and aesthetic magnitude, Skander's extraordinary imagination calls attention to the relations or differences between early African modernists who rose to subvert modernism's colonial hierarchy and countless Ethiopian modernists who emerged from a different history. So let me go to the 1960s in context where he was actually formed. So the intimate rapport between artists, writers, and student activists was vital in shaping the modernism of the 1960s, as well as in altering and manipulating its subsequent formulation. But I contend that Ethiopian intellectuals and artists provoked a body of knowledge that did not necessarily engage the histories and theories of colonialism, but instead focused on the politics of exploitation, rights, and exclusion. So in chapter 3 of my book, I examined the works of Skander Bogosian and Gabriel Christos Desta, two artists who are prominent in Ethiopian modernism's history. I also examined their broader social and cultural Pan-Africanist commitment, and that is their approaches and forms of resistance, negotiation, and transformation within the wider struggle against colonialism and racial injustice. So much has been written about Skander Bogosian, but aside from the writings of his friend and colleague, the late Solomon Deresa, who lived in Paris too, at the time Skander lived in Paris, any critical definition upon which to conceptualize his work has been limited relying on popular perceptions and recurring anecdotes. So often his works are described as dreamlike. His influence is traced to the Bauhaus expressionist Paul Klee and to the Afro-Cuban artist Wilfredo Lam. His love for music is attributed to jazz, and his elaborate work is basically boxed up with African motifs and symbols. However, his art has left a quintessential mark on Ethiopian modernism. His vigorous imagery presents an absorbing and critical account of the political culture of the colonial and post-colonial eras. So I like porous surfaces, Skinder had said to African-American jazz scholar Thomas Porter in 1980, especially things that remain in sands, textures left by sneakers, tractors, a tank, things which witness their time. And I'll repeat this word as we go along. So Solomon Deresa noted that Skinder traveled to all the historical sites in Ethiopia to experience what I call things which witness their time. So the magical scrolls made by Ethiopian Debteras, whose purpose was to ward off evil, became Skinder's channel of courage, and their invincibility attracted his creative buoyance. So the Debtera of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is a learned person who completes the same studies as a priest. However, unlike a priest, he can neither celebrate Mass nor take confession. So what's important about the Debtera for Skinder's works is his knowledge as astrologer, a scribe, and fortune teller. He's very well versed on traditional healing plants, and in many instances, he can invoke Satan to do good or evil by reciting mysterious Christian texts. So Skinder, so having said that, that gives you the background. He was born in 1937 during Benito Mussolini's occupation of Ethiopia to a father of Armenian descent and an Ethiopian mother. His father, Colonel Khosrow Gorgorios Bogosian, was an officer of the imperial bodyguard during the reign of Emperor Haile Selassie, and he was active in the resistance against the Italian occupation. His father, Colonel Khosrow, was taken to Italy as a prisoner of war when Skinder was just 1 year old and did not return to Ethiopia until Skinder was 8, thereby missing the most formative and tender periods of the boy's childhood. He was a student at a prestigious school called Tafari Makonnen School when he was introduced to Jacques Godbout, a French-Canadian writer and painter who was teaching French at the University College, currently Addis Ababa University. Godbout gave Skinder lessons in painting, and in Skinder's words, Godbout taught him to let the painting paint itself. So it was also then that Skinder met Larry Erskine, an African-American neighbor, who not only gave him feedback on his sketches and drawings, but introduced him to the Voice of America jazz program that used to be relayed to Addis Ababa from Tangier. From then on, music, and particularly jazz, molded and formed the colors, shapes, and yearning of his canvases. Jazz, said Solomon Deresa again, was so fully assimilated into Skinder's myths of birth, change, and dissolution that to this day, I cannot look at Skinder's painting without hearing Sonny Rollins or John Coltrane or Miles Davis. He danced to the music as he painted, and through the canvas, he heard the trumpet of Miles Davis, the keyboard of Thelonious Monk, and the saxophone of John Coltrane. And just like a jazz musician, he improvised while dancing to the beat, masterfully fusing and cajoling several art techniques. It is no surprise then that I even learned from Skinder Bogosian the complexity and yet simplicity of sound with jazz as its epitome. He rarely listened to standard jazz, preferring, for instance, Miles Davis's Bitches Brew to Kind of Blue. So for him, the cohesion between the jazz lyrics of the African-American, the melodious chant of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the rhythmic tunes of singers from Mali like Ali Farkature that he often listened to were all part of a natural reality. Each contained the other. He used to tell me that all his works were a perpetual celebration of the varieties of Blackness. So Godbout's painting lessons had been the extent of Skinder's art training when in 1955, at the age of 17, he won the second prize in abstract art at the National Art Exhibition held for the Jubilee anniversary celebration of Emperor Haile Selassie. And Skinder was awarded a scholarship to study abroad. He attended St. Martin's School of Art and Central School in London, as well as the École Supérieure des Beaux-Arts and the Académie de la Grande Chaumière in Paris. His education in jazz and his love for this style of music also took root in Paris, where the best of African-American jazz musicians had flocked. He knew all of the famed musicians, including Bud Powell, Lester Young, and Sonny Rollins, as well as all the visual and oral particulars of the Paris jazz world. Pretending to be an assistant, he later recalled when he was telling me, he carried Sonny Rollins' saxophone so he could get a seat in the front during the musicians' performances. And he even had a part in Louis Armstrong's 1969 movie, Paris Blues. So his presence among these jazz giants informed his exquisite knowledge of music, particularly jazz. And his experiences in Paris were consequently what crystallized in the conviction of his creative style. Solomon Deresa, who was also a student in Paris during the same time, described the experience. They were together at the time. He said, consider the situation for a moment. In 1957, London and Paris were in the middle of the 20th century, and Ethiopia in the 14th. And a 19-year-old Ethiopian student, more sheltered than most Addis Ababa teenagers, gets off the train at the Gare du Nord with no money for room and board and no papers, nothing except his will to learn to paint. And the only way to stay in Paris legally was to register at one of the institutions of higher learning for the then almost non-existent tuition fee. Iskender registered at the École Supérieure des Beaux-Arts. So I go to the Paris years. Iskender has said, I grew up in the streets of Paris. I had no problem being black or yellow or green. I learned my craft. So African art historians such as Chikao Keke Ogulu and Salah Hassan and curators such as Okwi and Vizor have written about African diaspora artists who lived in Paris in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It was these artists who appropriated the Parisian avant-garde's modernist technique and mediated their own coherent images. So one could say that African modernism developed its roots in diasporic artists of the liberation and independence movements and their politicized philosophy, and Iskender was part of this group. He did not stay long at École Supérieure des Beaux-Arts, where he had initially enrolled. So in 1957, he joined the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. The South African artist Gerard Scotto, whom Iskender had also befriended in Paris, introduced him to the great Cuban painter Wilfredo Lam in 1959 at the Second International Congress of Negro Writers in Rome. There are indeed vantage points, said Solomon, from which the world appears black, and not half bad as that. Paris of the mid-60s was it. So looking back, Iskender once wrote that the works of artists in Paris during that time were so varied that they at times confused his own work. But the confusion later became a suggestion when Iskender immersed himself in African mythology while still living in Paris, and his images explored the context and use of African symbolism and iconography.
Excuse me, Mrs. Giorgis, can you slow down a bit for the translators, please?
Okay.
Thank you. And do you have your PowerPoint?
Not yet. So no, I do.
Okay,
I'm
perfect.
the images. My talk is an hour, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Sorry.
So the strong connection he developed with the spiritual powers of African ancestors, which drove his creative will for much of his life, began in Paris. He often credited Christian Latier, the Ivorian sculptor who lived in the city around the same time and who created astonishing string and wire construction. So he said that Latier attached transcendental attributes to all of the artwork he produced, and that Latier's extraordinary constructions had become an enigma as he slowly developed somber paranoia in the latter part of his life. So considering, I think I'm going too fast for the translator, so I'm going to slow down. Considering that he was one of the avant-garde African artists who zealously expressed what it was to be African, Iskender was not given his due place in the history of art. The field of art history has long preserved separations between artists, between those who have sustenance from art history's institutional structures and those whose works it considers not yet or never worthy of its provisions. Iskender Bogosian was packaged as an artist of the 1960s and 1970s who played with African motifs and also as an artist who no longer held relevance in the 1990s. And this had confused him for most of his life. He was categorized by Western critics, historians, and curators as a byproduct of the anti-colonial cultural movement. And that was a fundamental misunderstanding of an arbitrarily imposed perspective by those who did not comprehend his works. And so as a consequence, he was rarely able to attract the interest of the major Western art platforms, particularly when it came to exhibiting works that were created after the 1990s. So Iskandar had trouble overcoming the association of his work with the liberation movements, but it is also true that his close acquaintance with pioneers of these movements, Aimé Césaire and Cheikh Anta Diop, left a lasting mark on his creative style. At the cafes Solomon wrote, we drank with and listened to the likes of the Senegalese polymath Cheikh Anta Diop and African-American writers Chester Himes, James Baldwin, and Richard Wright. Diop's primary preoccupation at the time was the deep organic unity of African culture. So according to friend and art critic Kifle Bishat, who lived in Paris with Iskandar in the early 1960s, and who also lived in Paris until his death a couple years ago, who he was also acquainted with Diop and Césaire, he had told me it was these two great personalities who deconstructed European historicism of African history and culture, and who distinctly shaped Iskandar's creativity by inculcating in him the role that African people have played in history and their impact on the development of early societies and institutions. So the same can be said of Aimé Césaire, who in 1963 wrote a poem, Éthiopie à Alioune Diop, published in Présence africaine. So, paying tribute to Ethiopia as being one of the most independent states in Africa, not colonized, her genealogy going to the imperial dynasty to Queen of Sheba and to Solomon. So for Iskandar Bogosian, whose experiences of colonialism were much different from those of his African counterparts, the valorization of the African aesthetic and intellectual tradition intriguingly marked a fundamental step in the assertion of Black identity. So as the African-American art historian Richard Powell has said, Iskandar Bogosian was part of a genre of African-American artists in Paris who had access to a whole range of Black expressive culture. He stated Iskandar's tight involvement in Paris with cultures like Présence africaine and Camus' Black Orpheus significantly altered his work curiously, making it both Pan-African and universal, an artistic balancing act that he, along with his fellow universalists, had perfected, and one that Sartre believed would push them out of past particularisms and into future universalism, which in turn would ultimately enact the twilight of their negritude. So for Iskandar, the consciousness of being an African in the diaspora was consequently an awareness of what it meant to be politically Black. It was during this historic development that Iskandar Bogosian's most important series of works, Nourishers, emerged. So I hope I can share the screen. So this is part of the Nourisher series. So all 12 works of the series were completed in Paris. 9 of them are presently unaccounted for, and only 2 are available in photographic images. This is the first batch of the Nourisher series. So poised between the living, the dead, and the unborn, Iskandar became immersed in the infinite realities of the universe. And in this pastel, gouache, and ink series, where the visible world was simply an isolated case in relation to the cosmos. Solomon called these images the ingenious infusion of spirit into ostensibly prosaic objects. So perhaps one can read this art form in association with the free play that was characteristic of surrealism. And indeed, Iskandar was often referred to in conjunction with the movement. Yet Iskandar was interested not only in the surrealist fascination with objects that were created or discovered by the unconscious, but also in the object's political potential. He spent a lot of time at the Musée de l'Homme at Trocadero. For Iskandar, the critical concern involved the intellectual, legal, and ethical grounds underpinning the ways in which African cultures and material heritage were treated and displayed. So in 1963, when Iskandar had completed the Nourisher series, a Parisian art critic by the name of Louise Acheson wrote, Iskandar's figures painted with graphic precision and a dexterity of line rise vertically in totemic design, speaking to each other sensually in a dialogue of organic force. That year, Iskandar had also read Amos Tutuola, a Nigerian writer, and his novel called The Palm Wine Drinker and My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, a book that he persistently referred to throughout his life. And as Solomon had said, it's difficult to imagine how the paintings that were done during the period that started in 1963 would have turned out had Tutuola not come into the picture. So this is called the Giorgis Flight of Delight and Terror. It's the collection of the North Carolina Art Museum, painted in 1963 again in Paris. So of this painting, Solomon has noted, as terrifying vast births take place, space penetrates space, spaces are nested within spaces, the vision menaces and delights at the same time. Images both attack and play. No doubt, reading Tutuola had something to do with the initial conceptualization of this canvas, but nothing in Tutuola leads to the range of energy in this painting. So this is painting, I think I put 63, but it was painted in 1964. It depicts the prominence of creation and destruction, and indeed, the vision delights, even as it equally terrifies. It's a multimedia composition showing many views of various objects. Like I said, the idea for it evolved in Paris at the height of Iskandar's acquaintances with African and African-American artists and intellectuals, prominently including Wilfredo Lam. This is another of Iskandar's painting made in Paris. This is the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's called Giorgis Wedding. It's a mixed media work and one of Iskandar's early experimentations with the magical scrolls. Once more, the iconography of this work consists of African conceptual schemes, images and textures merge and interlace, which is typical of his paintings, the renditions of his paintings. So these are called weaving composition that he calls kuluflufu, interwoven, which is a consistent theme in Ethiopian handicrafts. This interlacing of lines and textures also symbolizes Ethiopian medicinal scrolls, which depict the struggle between the spirits, objects, and dematerialization, as well as good and bad. So in 1964, the same year that he painted this painting, he had his first solo exhibition at the Galerie Lambert in Paris. And Solomon Deresa reported that the Paris critics were almost unanimous in their positive appraisal. His works in Paris subsequently served as a response to the period's vibrant debate about an African modernity in the making. His experimentation, he experimented with calligraphic art in Paris, heavily influenced by Ibrahim el-Salahi of Sudan. And Iskandar used to joke that an Ethiopian always sought abstraction with a bit of realism. And this was a motive for his Fidel or Ethiopic script paintings. Not only did he use the Ethiopic script in the composition of paintings, he molded it playfully on bark cloths, and I'll show you an example of that later on. So Iskandar's visual contribution began in Paris and was indeed stylistic and conceptually complex. He went back to Ethiopia in 1966 with an African-American wife, whom he met in Paris and taught at the Fine Art School until 1969. And whereas the Parisians brought new spiritual viewpoints and fresh imagery about Africa and the African experience, his works after he returned to Ethiopia mediated spaces between tradition and modernity, particularly the tradition of the Orthodox Church and the understanding of the modern world within this theology. So in 1969, after living in Ethiopia for 3 years, he left for the United States, following his African-American wife, where he would actively participate in the civil rights movement. He was invited to become an artist in residence at Atlanta University, as well as resident instructor in sculpting, painting, and African design at the Atlanta Center for Black Art. So he joined the staff of Howard University in 1972 and taught painting until 2001, played a major role in influencing artists like, I don't know if people are familiar with the Africa Cobra artists and Ethiopian artists, second generation Ethiopian artists as well. So while there, he continued to show works that he had been passionately involved in both in Paris and Ethiopia. And African art curator and historian Salah Hassan Samzira says, Skinder's impact goes beyond the modern African art movements to artists of African descent in the African diaspora. Arriving in the United States in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, Skinder witnessed the rise of the Black Power movement. The search for a new vocabulary rooted in the African experience, which accompanied these movements, has its share of cross-influences among African-American artists. Skinder has been an integral part of this. So this is another work owned by the Harn Museum in Florida. So of Skinder's works from the 1980s, his experimentation on bark cloth is especially noteworthy. Bark cloths are frequently used for burials in East African communities. The cloths are fragile, but are submerged in mud for an extended period of time to gain sufficient durability and strength to hold human remains. So he collected this bark when in his trip to Uganda. So he sculpted figures on these cloths so meticulously that once they're finished, they look stunning like this. So as Solomon said, at first glance, this image looks like an Ethiopian warrior's shield. The piece beauty is the material's natural tone, which accentuates the textures and forms molded on the cloth. The next image is my collection, I want to say. It's called Inferno at Aksum. The socialist Aksum is the obelisk in the northern part of Ethiopia. The socialist military junta in Ethiopia that ruled the country from 1974 to 1991 was gruesome. So that had brought depression into Skinder's life, and many of his works during this period narrated the themes of repression. This is one. It's Inferno at Aksum, painted in a powerful flaming red. The piece evokes disturbing images as it intimately recounts the ravages of conflict. So the shade of red indicates anger, power, danger, and the promises of a red communist flag that everybody was, protesting for communism to come during the 1970s had failed. So, and Aksum, the cradle of civilization, is burning in Skinder's Inferno, and its emotional impact inevitably captures the essence of carnage and despair in history. So Skinder Bogosian left a huge mark on Ethiopian modernism, and artists still execute variations of his work, and he explored new possibilities in articulating that modernism. So most emphatically, he was part of a culture of resistance in the 1960s, but he also continued to narrate social variations until his death. So let me go to the next artist, Gabra Christos Desta, which is, so I start with Gabra Christos is both a painter and a poet. So I start with this poem two painting, it's called, A Journey That Never Ends, miming and converting, swimming in colors, playing with lines and clashing with shadow and light, yearning to know, deep into space, searching. This is a poem to painting, it's called. So what can be said with certainty is that Gabro Christos Desta, like I said, was a powerful poet in addition to a painter. A man who both in words and images referenced the Ethiopian intellectuals' charged context of change and innovation in the 1960s. And I opened the book together with the anecdote I read that referred to Iskandar, with a poem written by one of Ethiopia's prolific poet and playwright, whose name is Agaye Gabramedin, who was a friend to both Iskandar and Gabro Christos. The poem is called Metne Yagirgida, a poem written in homage to Gabro Christos after his death in Oklahoma in the United States in 1981. He died alone in Oklahoma, and Agaye was touched by that predicament. And Metne Yagirgida, I cannot translate it literally, but it generally means the woes of the wall. Since he was alone, Agaye envisioned Gabro Christos simply staring at the wall, waiting for death to descend. And he refers to him as Gabre, short for Gabro Christos. So this is just an excerpt from this powerful poem, which is also really hard to translate literally. And you don't have to translate it, but I just want to read the poem too, because it's just, it becomes dry just talking about their works and stuff. These are the kind of things that surrounded them too, the poetic aspect of it. So I simply conveyed the general feeling of the poem. So I'll just read an excerpt, which I translated. Please tell me, bird, about his last gasp, you who flew to the downcast dusk. Of a place called Oklahoma, how did it sound? Trampled with morning chills, and struck with gravels of snow, that foreign land where the shattered light of loneliness bemoaned, uttered words of closure avowed. Please tell me, bird, about his last gasp, when the shades and hues of Ethiopia shattered. How did it sound? The conclusion, so Gabre. No proxy can come to compensate. But how was it? I.e., when a dream got swindled, in Oklahoma, a foreign land, your paintbrush is a torching flame. You blazed, Gabriel, but I don't know if you have died. So this is the poem that Agaye Gabramedin did, and I'll go to the next. This is his iconic figure. It's called iconic painting. It's one of the collections of the Modern Art Museum, Gabro Christos Desta Center. It's called Golgotha. So although Gabro Christos Desta questioned different modes of Ethiopian cultural agency, his works drew from a wide range of history and philosophy. So works such as this, Golgotha, addressed his experiences and his history. A painting of the crucifix depicted in bloody red. Golgotha portrays the suffering connected to the cross of Christ and is one of the most stunning pieces of Ethiopian modern art. In the Ethiopian Orthodox iconography, one never sees Christ in despair and despondency. But in Golgotha, there is no courage or hope, but only agony, as if the death of Christ imitates ordinary human death. Golgotha is not devotional like other crucifixes of the Orthodox Church, and moreover, it eclipses all illusions of hope, which is precisely contradictory to the message of the Orthodox Church. So with his great intervention in Ethiopian literary and visual modernism, Gabro Christos played a prominent role in the critical consciousness of this history. Like many of his friends, the writers, playwrights, and student activists of the 1960s, he believed in a new ideal of state and nation. Whereas some artists such as Iskandar Bogosian expressed the significance of colonial discourse in the liberations of freedom and justice, others like Gabro Christos Desta conveyed the urgency of change and innovation, but stopping short from examining the crisis and discontents of colonialism. So Gabro Christos Desta was born in 1932 in the eastern province of Ethiopia. His father, Aleka Desta, was a clergyman and a religious painter who worked on manuscript eliminations and other Orthodox Christian themes, and Gabra Christos learned many of his skills from his father. He completed his elementary education and finished high school in the eastern part of Ethiopia, and finished high school at another prestigious institution called General Wingate School. So he enrolled in Haile Selassie First University to study agricultural science, but later abandoned his studies to become an artist. In his early 20s, he developed a condition that altered his skin pigmentation, for which he unsuccessfully sought a cure at home and abroad. Many of his friends said that the stigma attached to his skin disease deeply affected him. His student, Desta Hagos, who is still living in Ethiopia, one of the prominent women artists, said she thought he had leprosy and was scared when she first met him, adding that he had told her it was not contagious and that it was dead. So his self-portrait is a curious depiction within a culture that stigmatized and shunned his body. So he's greatly influenced by German expressionist styles. He used his own image on this self-portrait to probe the complexities of the human soul, perhaps one of the most great masterpieces of Ethiopian modernism. His self-portrait was an expressionist study of himself. It's currently owned by an Ethiopian businessman called Noah Azmi. So bold, harsh, and angular lines seize a most graphic image, right? So the face is rendered in two separate and distinct elements. The left side is painted with a blue tone, and the right is highlighted in a shade of white. So in a move that seems to recount his emotional imprisonment, the right eye is painted closed, thus altering the humanity of a face whose identity appears to have locked down. And the shirt is disheveled. In a poem about his skin condition, he had said, he once wrote, "I could have been someone else. It's only myself that I am unable to be." Put simply, the passionate intensity of his self-portrait powerfully illustrates his personal life in a society that failed to empathize with his rare skin condition. So earlier in his work, he got involved in painting themes such as begging and prostitution, but it was in Germany that he made a methodological shift. So at a time when abstract art was foreign to many Ethiopians, Gabra Christos insisted that abstract art mirrored a much desired modern awareness. And just like his friends, like the playwrights, the student activists and writers, he initially believed in the promises of Euro-American modernity. And just like these characters, he portrayed ambivalence, moral doubt, and anxiety about vernacular culture. So works such as this, Green Abstract, made in 1963, collection of the Modern Art Museum, the Rokistofta Center, such as Green Abstract, centered on a shining circle, a dominant symbol in many of his early paintings and emblems. So in various unpublished works, Gabra Christos acknowledged, albeit hesitantly, customary reference to his works. Works such as Green Abstract were generative of new modes of making and looking at art. Abstract art was newly available for consumption, and the broader public could not understand this form of art because it was distinctly different from the visual expressions the public was used to, which were church art and its manifestation in modern execution. So even for some of his younger students, his work seemed strange. Taye Weldemedin, who is a painter now in Ethiopia, an artist, one of his students, confessed that as a student, he was not interested in much of Gabra Christos' paintings, and said that at the time, students were not exposed to abstract painting. So there was a lot of criticism against Gabra Christos' work. So in 1963, Gabra Christos remarked, "It is funny that people who know nothing about the history of art attach such exaggerated importance to the art of their own country. They don't realize how international art really is. Picasso would hardly have created his cubism had he not seen African art. Matisse was influenced by Islamic traditions. Gauguin went as far as Tahiti to find new inspirations. We create ultra-modern houses in our developing countries. We build superhighways on which we drive the latest model cars from all over the world. We use all sorts of up-to-date international styles in technology, science, education, medicine, and what have you. Why in the world should art be different? So, but what appeared to so familiarly modern to Gabriel Christos also had its own historicity. For instance, consider the avant-gardism of Picasso and company that Gabriel Christos indicated was intended to critique civilization by embracing an imagined primitiveness of Africans whose authenticity they played in opposition to a decadent West. So African artists such as Tinder changed Picasso's avant-gardism into a politicized philosophy that challenged European cultural primacy. But African modernism consequently owes its scholarship to the various types of deconstructive arguments against European modernism. So, but like many intellectuals of the period, Gabriel Christos did not address the colonial/decolonial sensibility when he talked about the cross-cultural influences of modern art. And again, another remark from him, so to give you a better perspective of how he thought. So modern art, he says, reflects the artist's view of the world, its intricacies, its beauty, and its creativity. Art can no longer be comprehended in a confined way like it had for centuries. Today, the modern world understands art as a basis of knowledge to investigate many things. The larger public will find it difficult to appreciate modern art until these rules and regulations are fully deciphered. So he clearly foresaw the role of art in shaping national consciousness, but he did not explore whether the colonized should emulate the West or seek a whole new set of values and ideas that were grounded in an Ethiopian thought system. So the most important thing that students, artists, and writers failed to challenge during that time effectively were the prejudices of the European model. So attempting to reconcile the dichotomy between Gabriel Christos and those who did not understand his art form, Solomon Deresa, who also wrote about Gabriel Christos, said, a portrait of a German girl. This is the portrait, remembering Marga. It's called 1965, and it's a collection of the Gabriel Christos Testa Museum in Addis. A portrait of a German girl by a good Ethiopian painter is necessarily more Ethiopian than either a portrait of an Ethiopian face by a foreigner, a schmaltzy portrait of an Ethiopian peasant by a slick Ethiopian painter. The schmaltz is neither Ethiopian nor un-Ethiopian, but quite simply bad. In short, it's difficult to realize how good work by a sincere Ethiopian artist can be anything but Ethiopian. So he's talking about this portrait. So, like I said, Gabriel Christos' art was met with harsh criticism by journalists and newspaper articles. After returning from Germany, they attacked him by saying he immersed himself by way of a foreign art that was difficult to understand. But what was ironic here was the criticism leveled by numerous people regarding his absorption with European art forms, largely unconcerned. They were largely unconcerned with the complex relationship between European art forms that they said Gabriel Christos accepted on the one hand, and an exclusively Ethiopian art form with modern intonations that they wanted crafted on the other. So their disapproval simply reflected their own inability to understand the artist's work. So the group of critics, composed of journalists and a few people from the educated elite, in the meantime celebrated the novels, dramas, and poems of the period. But this was an interesting paradox for me, in which the visual art was not seen as a product of historical sources, and the indigeneity of the visual art form mattered most. For this group of critics, art was only for decorative purposes. Ideally, in their opinion, it would be created in a realist mode with the elements of traditional culture evident. So this kind of perception still exists today, where the visual art is not part of the larger academic inquiry.
Elizabeth?
Yes.
Sorry, we will have to come to the end if we want to spare very little time for questions and for the next speakers.
Okay, let me show you some of the paintings, and this is another one, like in the latter part of the 70s, he started painting. He became more in tune with the country's problems and started painting the gruesome nature of the Derg in the military rule that took over the country in 1974. This is called in the third world, mummified figures. The next one is called In the Grotto. And this is 1978. Soon after that, he immigrated to the US and died in Oklahoma, like I said, in 1981. So I want to conclude, because I'm told to conclude. So the creative arts movement, which simultaneously subjugated and reproduced in the 1960s, came to an end. This is another one that he did about the family. Came to an end after the 1974 revolution, when the monarchy was abolished. But the revolution was soon hijacked by a socialist military junta, which claimed the very same Marxist-Leninist political philosophies that had armed intellectual thought. And I'll conclude here with Gabriel Christos's famine painting. So from abstraction, he went to this realistic paintings like this. That's it, okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the fascinating talk about these painters, and also the complexity that we need to situate the work and also the debates. And maybe we can take a few questions if there are in the room.
Excuse me, you mentioned briefly for the first artist some calligraphic influence, or during his stay in Paris. That was during the early 60s. Is that what you said?
Yes.
And did he use the calligraphy in his work, or it was just a kind of a formal influence?
Yeah, no, he didn't do much calligraphy while he was in Paris, but he was very good friends with Ibrahim El Salahi, who briefly lived in Paris during that time too. So continued in the 80s and 90s, he used a lot of calligraphy in his works, particularly the one made on bark cloths. Mm-hmm. He used a lot of calligraphy, which is Ethiopian scripts. He used Ethiopian scripts throughout his paintings. On the bark cloths, as well as in the mixed media compositions as well. Yeah.
So when you say calligraphy is more about the scripts, or is also the formal aesthetic, visualization of it?
Well, depending, but yeah, he aestheticized the Ethiopian script.
Okay.
The Ethiopian script, he aestheticized it. So I think he's the first one to have done that. I haven't seen, of course, there are other artists who came later on, like Wesane Khosrow, who uses a lot of calligraphy, but not in its aesthetic form. Skender played with them, he played with them a lot.
Okay, now I was asking because there was a lot of artists, particularly in the late 50s, that were also French or European, that were using calligraphy under the influence of Oriental calligraphy. So it was more gestural kind of form. And that's why I was interested about what you said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, maybe what could also be of interest is that for the last years there was a deeper interest in the archives of the École des Beaux-Arts. And there are some strange aspects in these archives, as for example in the registers you can't find evidence of artists coming from Ethiopia, but you can find them in the atelier lists and also in the dossier d'élèves sometimes. So I think that that would need also further investigation, also to see who were the artists present at the same time, and this transnational aspect that was quite important for the ateliers at this time. So maybe, yeah, there would be also some interesting material that could be uncovered for more yes, evidence.
That's interesting because there were actually, I'm only familiar with Iskandar being the only artist, Ethiopian artist who was in Paris at the time, in the 60s. Of course, there were other African artists, but the only Ethiopian artists that I'm familiar with, there were the Solomon Derecha that I mentioned, who's a poet who was going to school at the same time here, and Keflebish At, who just passed away like a couple of years ago, who lived in Paris throughout from the 1960s on. But the only artist I'm familiar with is Iskandar, and most of his works around that time, I don't know, nothing. I don't think nothing has been left at the Chaumière or École des Beaux-Arts. So I think I don't know. I mean, it would be very interesting to look into that archive too and see what's going on. It would be really nice. I would love to work on that. So we'll see.
Well, I would be happy to send you some material.
Oh, that'd be great. That would be great. Thank you so much.
Is there any other? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I noticed that some of the collections you mentioned of the artists is probably mostly in the United States. There's a mention of Paris and France. Are there works by Iskandar that have been collected by the National Museum or Gallery in Ethiopia? And does his work still influence contemporary Ethiopian artists? How are the works of pioneer Ethiopian artists linked to what happens now in Ethiopia? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, no, there are few works. I mean, the National Museum of Ethiopia has a few works of Iskandar. But there are private collectors who had collected earlier and who are collecting now. You know, nowadays his works are very popular. It's being auctioned in auction houses. I've written some essays for both Sotheby's and Bonhams. So, you know, his works have been sold in the market. So it's becoming popular. Unfortunately, not too many people. I mean, not too many people have collected his works before his death. But there are some collection at the National Museum. And yeah, but Iskandar played a very major role because he only taught at the art school for 3 years, 1966 to 69, but he played a major influence on many artists. First of all, his art was not really, it played on Ethiopian motifs. So a lot of people a lot of the artists, a lot of the student artists are familiar with that. You know, they can get comfortable with that type of expression. So it's still being copied. The funny part is still being copied, his work. You know, the motifs that he used are being used by third generation now artists, younger artists still, because it's mostly concerned not only in Ethiopian motifs, but also African motifs as well, where for students who are very familiar with these motifs, so they continue doing it. But the funny part is the philosophy behind Iskandar's works have never been captured by second generation or third generation artists. You know, for him, it was a struggle against colonialism, against, for the independence of Black people, not only in Paris, after he came back to Ethiopia and went back to the US, that was, his whole life was the struggle for freedom and equality, for justice and equality. So that's never been captured by, I don't want to say never, but rarely been captured by second and third generation artists, although his style of painting is still being copied. I hope that answers your question.